This is episode 4.
Screen? Of course. For some reasons, if you consume screen, of course. You have no idea why? Of course. For some reasons, vigility. If I consume, right? Of course. For some reasons, vigility. Until I didn't know this, definitely. Has a good point, vigility. If you consume. Yep. Because you have no idea, right? See? Of course. If you consume vigility, see? Of course. You have no idea. Vigility. If I consume, right? See? Of course. If you consume vigility. If I consume, okay? You have no idea, right? If you consume vigility. You have no idea, right? See? Of course. If you consume usually 3, of course. If you consume usually, if you consume, right? 3, of course. You have no idea, right? If you consume usually 3, of course. If you consume, right? 3, of course. You have no idea. 3, of course. 3. Yep, if you consume usually. Until I didn't notice, right? 3. Of course. If you consume 3, of course. You have no idea. If I consume, right? 3, of course. You have no idea, right? 3, of course. You have no idea, right? If you consume usually 3, of course. If you consume usually until I didn't notice, okay? 3, of course. If you consume usually until I didn't notice, right? If you consume vigilantly, 3, of course. For some reasons, if you consume 3, of course, you have no idea. If you consume vigilantly, 3, of course, you have no idea, right? 3, of course. For some reasons, right? If you consume vigilantly, 3. I know, right? If I consume vigilantly until you already know this, right? If you can see visually, screen, of course. If you can see visually, screen, of course. Cause you have no idea, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? If I consume screen, of course. You have no idea. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. If you consume visually, screen, of course. You have no idea, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. If you consume visually, because I have no idea, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? If you consume visually, screen, of course. If you consume screen, of course. If I consume, right? Screen, of course. If you consume screen, of course. Eventually. Because I have no idea, right? If I consume eventually. So, if I consume, right? Of course. You have no idea, right? Because you have no idea. Eventually. Because I said so. Because you have no idea. For some reasons, right? If you consume screen, of course. If I consume, right? If you consume screen, of course. You have no idea. If you consume of course. You have no idea, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, visually, if I consume. Until I didn't know this, right? If you consume visually, screen, of course. You have no idea, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. If you consume visually, screen, of course. If I consume visually, so I didn't notice. Screen, no, right? If I consume visually, until I didn't notice, right? Screen, of course. For some reason, visually. So, if you consume screen, of course. For some reasons, visually. Until I did this. If you consume screen, of course. If you consume screen, of course. You have no idea, right? If you consume visually, screen, of course. You have no idea. Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? If you consume visually, until you notice, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. If you assume screen, of course. You have no idea, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. If you consume visually, until I didn't know this, right? If you consume visually, screen, of course. If you consume, right? Screen, of course. If you consume, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. Screen, I know, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, visually, because you have no idea, right? Screen, of course. If you consume visually, until I know this, right? Screen, of course. If you consume visually, screen, of course. You have no idea. Screen, I know, right? If you consume Julie, screen, of course. Because you have no idea, right? Screen, of course. If I consume, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? If you consume Julie, because you have no idea. If you consume, right? Screen, of course. For some reasons, right? If you consume Julie, screen, of course. Because you have no idea, right? Screen, of course. If you consume, screen, of course. If you consume, screen, of course. For some reasons, right? Screen, of course. You have no idea, right? Screen, of course. If you consume Julie, screen, of course.